of that up until the Travis part. That was clear. So I definitely need to work on my Swedish. So I hope that you can understand me today in English. So just by way of introduction, if you maybe haven't seen me before, I'm Travis Wright, and I'm joined today by Chris Ross. I'm a former Microsoft program manager. I was on the product team for Windows Server and System Center for 11 years. I was the lead program manager for operations manager and service manager for a long time. And I spent the last couple of years as the community lead PM for Windows Server and System Center. And so I would go out to community events just like this, meet with lots of people all over the world. I did a lot of blogging. I managed our relationships with the 510 Windows Server and System Center MVPs all over the world. And so it was a really great opportunity to kind of go out and just see how people are using Microsoft's products and find out what the concerns were, what the challenges were, what things were going well, and then channel all of that feedback back to the product group to help them create the next version of Microsoft's products. And I really enjoyed that for a couple of years, but I got to the point where I missed the actual creation of software. I missed being that innovative, person and creating software. And so 2 months ago, I left Microsoft after 11 years to join a startup company around a system center called Cyrison. And we primarily specialize in extensions to Service Manager, and Chris is our corporate practice lead for our services organizations. We do consulting around System Center as well. And I just love coming to events like this because I get an opportunity to just meet the people that I see online all the time, in the forums, on Twitter, all these different engagements that we have. And I just love meeting people in person and getting a chance to talk about how you're using Microsoft's products, what the challenges are, and so on. And that part of my job I really don't see changing. Even now that I'm at Cyrison, I still spend a lot of time out in the community just trying to learn about what it is that people are doing out there and what now I can do at Cyrison to help fill the gaps where they exist in the Microsoft product portfolio. And we can provide services to help people actually deploy Microsoft's product portfolio. Now that I'm not officially a Microsoft employee, I can have a little bit more fun now and be a little less corporate maybe. So excuse me if I, sort of have a little fun here. Don't hold it against me. Hopefully everybody enjoys a little fun. So, as I go out and for the last couple of years, I've been talking to all these customers and trying to get a sense of what people perceive Microsoft's strategy to be and so on. I get this feedback from people that, one does not simply go to the cloud, It's really just not as straightforward as Microsoft's marketing message might make it seem. There's a lot of challenges and obstacles in the way to adopting the cloud. And, I've heard a lot of these challenges. And so today, what I want to do is talk about what those challenges are and what Microsoft and their partners are doing to eliminate those roadblocks to going to the cloud, adopting the cloud. And so, this is just kind of a funny thing. This is sort of the perception that it seems like people have about Microsoft's cloud vision. It's like Azure is this big thing that's going to take over the world. Steve Ballmer is, what's the bad guy's name? Anyway, what's his name? Sauron. Yeah, thank you. But really, it's not like that. It's, it's really much more of a, kind of a Fellowship of the Ring type of approach. We're kind of all in this together. Microsoft is trying to figure out what it means to go to the cloud and take advantage of the cloud. Their partners like Cyrison here, we're trying to figure it out. You're trying to figure out. We're all in this together, and we're all trying to move forward with this. And so today, what I want to do is just talk about some of those challenges that we face and how what Microsoft is doing helps us actually realize the benefits of the cloud and kind of work together on this journey. So some of the challenges that I hear about from people in adopting the cloud, right, is first of all, there's governance, okay? So if you think about the governments out there, they impose regulations on companies. And as I talk to some companies, they say that they're required by law to keep their data within a data center that's within their country, right? There's a lot of, especially banks or government institutions, that's a legal requirement that they have to meet. And so they would often ask me, well, how am I supposed to adopt Azure when you don't have an Azure data center in my country? It's over. There's no way for a company or a government organization to use Azure in that situation. Similarly, we've seen some interesting things happen with the NSA and how they're accessing data, and that's a big concern for a lot of companies and governments, especially in Europe. It's an interesting thing. So we've got the NSA Nazgul here representing. So people are concerned about putting their data out into a data center where the NSA or other types of organizations or even criminals might get access to it. And so that's one challenge that people face. Another challenge is connectivity. So people would tell me that they have a challenge with connectivity where maybe their internet connection speed is not very fast or it's not very reliable. They have people all over the world that are connected by, in some cases, slow links. And the links that they have, if they want to have a high-speed connection, that can be really expensive for them. And that's also an inhibitor to adopting the cloud. And then lastly, people tell me about they're concerned about the loss of control. They don't want to lose control of their data. They don't want to lose control of managing their infrastructure. And they also are concerned about losing control of the security of their data. And so these are all real concerns that people have about adopting the cloud. Do some of you guys face these same challenges in adopting the cloud? Does this make sense to you? You have these kinds of challenges? Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so the next thing I want to kind of talk about is just, what is cloud computing, if we were to get a definition of that. And so I went and searched around on the internet for kind of what I felt was a good definition of cloud computing. And I found a definition created by a US government organization called the National Institute of Standards for Technology, or NIST. And they defined cloud as being 5 different things. The first one is on-demand self-service. So with on-demand self-service, somebody that's consuming cloud computing should be able to on-demand at any time request anything that they need, and it should be automatically done and more or less immediately available for them to use. And they should be able to access that from anywhere via broad network access. So they should be able to access these cloud resources over the internet. They should be able to authenticate using various forms of authentication. And they should be able to do it on any device from anywhere. Okay? And then there's resource pooling. So resource pooling is taking various network infrastructure components, whether it's storage, network, compute, and pooling those together into a resource pool, and then allowing people to subscribe to and use portions of that resource pool. And by doing this, we increase the efficiency of computing. In the kind of older data center model, you'd have a server in a rack, and it might only be utilizing 2% of the CPU available and a very small amount of the overall RAM. And so it wasn't very efficient. With virtualization, where we can layer multiple virtual machines onto a single physical infrastructure and pool together these resources, we get much higher utilization of those hardware resources. And that's great for things like cost control. We want to keep our costs down, and we can do that by more efficiently using the hardware we already have. It's also good for the environment. When we have more efficient use of computing hardware, we can reduce the overall environmental impact. Next is rapid elasticity. I think Eva mentioned this with the Nobel Peace Prize website. She was talking about how they grew on demand, right? Yeah, clearly, I know Swedish. I understood that. I heard nobelpeaceprize.org, and she did this, and I knew what she meant, yeah. So, cloud computing, there's an element of rapid elasticity where I can scale up and scale down without having to go and acquire a lot of new hardware, install that hardware, configure it, and so on, because I'm accessing computing power from a pooled resource. And that's also good for cost control and good for the environment. And lastly is measured service. And so with measured service, what we're talking about here is when you have a service provider and a service consumer, and they have a contract, an agreement between the two of them, and there's a way to measure the performance of that service, that drives good behavior. Okay, so that makes sure that the service provider is providing a high availability and good performance. And when you start to associate costs with it, then people that are consuming the service, they have better behavior too. They start to turn off the machines that they're not using, or they might turn them off at night when they go home. And so that actually helps control costs as well, because there is that agreement in place between these organizations. So I think this is a pretty good definition of what cloud computing is. Now, one thing that you'll notice here is that there's no reference to anything about location. Okay, so it doesn't say anything about that cloud computing is something off in some data center in Chicago, right? So I would suggest that cloud computing has nothing to do with the location. Cloud computing is a method of computing that can be done anywhere. And what we're going to talk about today is how Microsoft's strategy enables cloud computing to happen in the cloud, or what people think of as like an Azure cloud or an Amazon cloud, as well as at other service providers that are maybe more local, as well as in your own data center. And so what we're going to talk about is how Microsoft's strategy enables that benefit of cloud computing regardless of the location that you're in. And that strategy that Microsoft has, I think Eva mentioned this too, is called the Cloud OS, and we're going to talk about today. And it's all about creating one consistent platform regardless of where you're running your cloud computing. So what I want to do is I want to kind of stop for just a minute and talk about the history of the commoditization of electricity. This is kind of an interesting analogy. So electricity started out, and we had dynamos. They were hand cranked. And you would crank a dynamo, and it would wrap a wire around a coil, and it would generate electrical sparks. Over time, they invented a way for electricity to be transmitted via a relay. And so electricity could be transmitted over a long distance. So it started out the electricity was very local to the dynamo, and you could hook something up to it. It was very, very local. It's close by. With the invention of the relay, you could send electricity over a long distance. And so Thomas Edison, shortly after he invented the light bulb, started the first central electric power plant in New York. And it was powered by steam generators that would crank the dynamos, and it would send electricity out to 3,000 light bulbs in New York City. And so then, about the same time, there was hydroelectric dams started producing electricity and sending it out. And over time, we invented other ways of generating electricity, such as solar panels or wind energy. There's all different types of ways to generate electricity today and send it out. So today, everyone consumes their electricity from a service provider for the most part, right? You don't really generate your own electricity. You typically get it from a service provider. In some cases, it may make sense for you to produce your own electricity. For example, if you're a hospital, you may want to have a backup generator that can generate electricity in case you can't get electricity from the service provider. Or you might have a house that's up in the mountains and it's far away from the electrical wires to connect to get electricity, and so you might generate your own electricity there. But for the most part, most people get their electricity from a service provider. So if you get your electricity from a service provider, you are paying as you go. It's an operational expense. You only pay for what you use. It's a shared capacity of infrastructure that's available, and it's scalable and elastic. Is this sounding familiar? Okay, see where I'm going with this, right? If you produce it yourself, there's a lot of upfront costs. You have to purchase the equipment to be able to produce the electricity. You have an ongoing operational cost to operate that equipment, but you maintain it and you have control over it. So it may be more or less total cost compared to getting it from a service provider, depending on a lot of factors, but the cost is only one important factor to consider. The other factors are that you have control over it. So why am I telling you all this? Because basically what's happening with computing capacity is it's becoming a commodity, just like electricity did. So today, we're moving into a model now where we consume compute capacity from a service provider. And that service provider could be somebody like Amazon or Azure, or a local service provider that's down the street from your company. And they're providing these services to you, this compute capacity service. And just as we saw with electricity, you only pay for what you use. It's an ongoing operational cost. You're using a shared capacity and infrastructure, and it's scalable and elastic. But in some cases, you may want to produce your own compute capacity as an enterprise. And so you may have your own data center with your own servers, and the same pattern is true there. You have a high capital expense at first. You have an ongoing operational expense to maintain it, but there are other benefits too, like you get to have control over it. So where does Microsoft fit into this picture? Microsoft is both a service provider. They provide compute capacity from Azure, and they're also what I would call a technology provider. So where if you wanted to generate your own electricity, you would have to get electricity generating technology from someone. Like you would buy a solar panel from some technology producer, and you'd install it at your house, and you would generate your own electricity. Well, Microsoft is a technology provider for generating cloud compute capacity. And what we're going to look at today is the technology that they're providing is Windows Azure, running within your own data center. So we're going to talk about that. All right. Okay, so now what I want to talk to you about is a project at Microsoft that was codenamed Catal. Anybody heard of Catal, Project Catal? A few people, some of the MVP guys in the front, right? So there's this project called Catal. Okay, if we were to just look at Catal at a glance, what is it? It is a website provisioning and management service. It is a database provisioning and management service. So if somebody can come in and they can request databases, they can request websites, they get deployed onto a shared infrastructure. It also allows you to stand up instances of the Windows Azure Service Bus and use that as a platform as a service component. It also provides for the ability to provision and manage virtual machines on a shared infrastructure, as well as configure and manage virtual networks. On top of all of this infrastructure ability to manage those infrastructure pieces is a single unified API called the Service Management API. And then on top of that are two different portals, one for the administrators to configure and manage this shared infrastructure, and the tenant portal where a tenant can come in and they can request these different services and manage those services once they're provisioned. So if you look at the architecture of Catal, it starts with Windows Server as the foundation layer. And then on top of that, you have Hyper-V, which is the virtualization layer. And then on top of that, you have System Center. So you've got Virtual Machine Manager, Operations Manager, and Orchestrator. And then on top of that, you have the Service Provider Foundation, which is a web service API on top of all of that. And then you have the Service Management API on top of that. Now, the pieces that you see over here on the left, the Service Bus, this is a Windows Azure service. SQL Server is SQL Server, and IIS is IIS. We all know what these are. And then there's this PaaS provisioning and management engine that comes with this project Catal. And we'll talk about that in more detail. But this is the architecture of Catal. This is what it does, right? And so they called it Project Catal. And what Catal does is it delivers cloud computing on-premise. So kind of all the promises of cloud computing. If you look at the definition of cloud computing, it delivers that on-premise. So starting with on-demand self-service, the tenant portal creates a user experience for a tenant to come in and request. They can basically subscribe to a plan. They can request capacity. They can request services like databases, websites, virtual machines, virtual networks, and so on. And they can provision applications on top of this infrastructure. And all of this is done through a self-service user experience. So it meets that requirement of cloud computing. It enables broad network access because you can access it from anywhere using any device, just using a browser, over the internet, or through your corporate network. It enables resource pooling because you have a shared infrastructure for hosting SQL Server databases, websites, and virtual machines. And you can go in and you can request to have a portion of that capacity provided to you. And multi-tenancy is built into this platform from the beginning. Oops. And then it also provides rapid elasticity, so you can go in and you can request additional capacity as you need. And when you don't need that capacity, you can turn it off. And you can manage your capacity across clouds as well. So if you have multiple virtual machine clouds, you can manage that from a central location. And lastly, there's a measured service that's being provided. You have a plan that you're subscribing to. That plan has costs and service levels associated with it. And that's the contract between the tenant and the service provider. So Project Catal actually provides for all of these pieces of the definition of cloud computing, but it's doing it on-premise, not in the cloud out there somewhere. And so the code name was Project Catal. The first release of this, they officially named it Windows Azure Services for Windows Server. Only Microsoft can come up with names like that for their products. You know, the next version was going to be Windows Azure Services for Windows Server R2 SP1 CU4. Okay. So that name didn't last long. And in the version that was released, well, so first of all, I thought that we should actually name this something more like System Center IaaS/PaaS Manager, or Skip 'em. I thought that was a great name. I pitched it to the marketing team. They didn't like it. Fine, I'm not a marketing guy. What do I know? We should just leave it with Windows Azure Services for Windows Server. That's better. So they actually ended up naming this Windows Azure Pack when it was released with System Center 2012 R2. So a lot of people probably heard of Windows Azure Pack? A few? No? Mm-hmm. Oh, okay, a few. All right. That's good. So this is a new solution from Microsoft that enables cloud computing on-premise. And that's kind of what we're going to talk about today, and we're actually going to take a look at a demo of it. And this ability to run basically all these Windows Azure services on-premise in your data center and manage it with System Center, the ability to have this one consistent platform, whether you're running it in Azure, at a service provider, or on-premise, is what Microsoft calls the Cloud OS. I think Eva mentioned that at the beginning, right? I heard her say Cloud OS a few times. So, okay, so that's the Cloud OS, and so their vision, here's the cloud that Eva showed. We started out with private cloud, and private cloud was basically just Windows Server as your hypervisor, and then you could put System Center on top of that, and you could create a virtualization infrastructure that was shared. And we've expanded upon that. So, we introduced things like the Cloud Service Process Management Pack for Service Manager that allowed for self-service provisioning of virtual machines and management of those virtual machines and so on. So we started out with private cloud, and you could monitor it with Ops Manager. You could automate it with Orchestrator, and that was private cloud. And then at the same time, Microsoft was developing Windows Azure, which is sort of the public, big cloud out there. And Microsoft started out with platform as a service. So they were creating an application development platform service with various development platform services, but they didn't start with virtualization infrastructure. That came later as they added support for IaaS. Okay, and then service providers is now a focus for Microsoft. So as Microsoft sees more and more businesses, especially smaller sized businesses, moving to consuming their compute capacity from a service provider, Microsoft wants to make sure that they are involved in that market as well, to make sure that service providers are using Microsoft technology. So service providers historically have offered Windows Server as a guest within their environment, as an offering to their customers, but they were typically running that infrastructure on VMware, lots of Linux, and all kinds of other things. And so Microsoft is now going after service providers to get them to use this same cloud management platform that is being used in Azure as well as on-premise. So that's a big focus for them. Now, what happens here is you've got the Windows Azure platform, and you've got the Windows Azure pack that's running in your own data center for private cloud purposes, or the Windows Azure pack running in a service provider. Okay, so now Microsoft is kind of changing. It feels a little weird for me to talk about Microsoft as like somebody else. Normally I would say we, right? We are changing our, and in fact, you know, now at Syracuse, we're actually following this same pattern as we're changing the way that we are designing our software and building it just like Microsoft is. And the idea is that we want to design for the cloud computing model. So we saw earlier what it means to be doing cloud computing. And when we create applications and services, we want to design it so that it's designed for the cloud. So we want to design it to be scalable. We want to design it to be very easy to operate. And that means that people don't have to have a whole lot of training in order to be able to operate something. It's easy to diagnose what's wrong with things and so on. We want it to be reliable. We want it to be very secure. We want it to have multi-tenancy built into it. We want to have RESTful APIs that make it easy to integrate with other systems. And so there's kind of a change in how you build your applications if you want to build it to manage the cloud or to run in the cloud. And we're doing the same thing at Syracuse now. And so what will happen is that Microsoft is going to create these services and applications going forward such that they can run at Microsoft in Azure, or they can be run at a service provider, or they can be run on-premise in an enterprise. It's the same exact technology running in any of those three different locations, but it's designed for the cloud first. That's kind of a big change in how Microsoft and other partners now are developing their software. And we can see some examples of this with existing products that Microsoft has out in the marketplace. So these are software as a service that Microsoft has, where they've taken SharePoint, and you can run that in your own data center if you want. You can consume it from a service provider, or you can consume SharePoint through Office 365. It's basically the same technology, but you can use it in any of these three different places. Similarly with Link, you can run on-premise if you want. You can get Link as a service from a service provider, or you can get Link through Office 365. Same thing with Exchange. You can do Exchange on-premise, hosted Exchange, or Office 365. Visual Studio, I am a huge fan of the new Team Foundation service that Microsoft has. We use that at Syracuse now. It's so great to just be able to put all of our source code and work items up in the cloud and be able to access that from anywhere. But if you want to, you can also have a TFS server on-premise, or you can have a service provider host it for you. So what we're seeing there is a change in how software is being built. So let's look at how Microsoft has been building this cloud OS. So to start with, let's take a look at Windows Azure. Windows Azure provides a number of different application services. So things like the Active Directory in Windows Azure, you've got BizTalk services, you've got the Service Bus, you've got multi-factor authentication that's really cool. SQL Azure, you've got all these different services that are provided for the purpose of building applications on top of Windows Azure. And what they've done is they've taken some of these services and they've made them available to run on-premise or at a service provider through the Windows Azure pack. So they started with SQL databases, and websites and virtual machines. Those three services, the way that those are provisioned and managed in Windows Azure is the same infrastructure that you get when you deploy Windows Azure Pack on-premise or at a service provider. Now they've gone beyond that in the R2 release. They've now started to provide Active Directory services as part of Windows Azure Pack. The service bus is now a service that's available in the Windows Azure Pack. And they've also done virtual network. So they've added in all these different services. And so what we're seeing now is if you go to Azure, you'll see the full list of services as provided by Microsoft. If you go to a service provider or you run it on-premise with the Windows Azure Pack, you get a subset of the services. Over time, Microsoft will take those services that are being provided in Azure and they will make them available to run on-premise or at a service provider, so that there's eventually a consistent platform across all of these three things. Now, there's also technology that's being delivered the other way. So for example, Windows Server 2012 R2 is now the hypervisor for IaaS in Windows Azure. It didn't used to be that way. It used to be a separate branch of the hypervisor. It wasn't actually the same hypervisor that ships in Windows Server, but now it is. So we see technology going both from kind of the on-premise Windows Server technology to Azure, and we see Azure services coming to on-premise. So we're seeing technology going both ways to create this one consistent platform. Okay, so this is coming back to the architecture slide that we saw earlier. So this management engine that I referred to here, this is called the Azure RDFE. That is the same engine that's used in Azure. And that engine is now delivered as part of the Windows Azure Pack so you can run it on-premise. Services like the service bus are the same service bus that's provided in Windows Azure, but you're running it on-premise at either a service provider or in your own data center. The other interesting thing is the portals. So the portals are actually built on the same framework that the Windows Azure portals are. The content of those portals is slightly different, but the user experience is very similar because they're built in the exact same framework. All right, so now I'm going to hand it over to Chris, and he's going to do a demo of the Windows Azure Pack for us. Wow, that's going to be hard.
A little bit. That's okay. We'll roll with it. All right, so thank you for your patience. What we have here is the Windows Azure portal itself. As you see, we can log in, and from here we see a lot of the same things that Travis was showing us in the slide deck. Specifically, from an administration side, administrators can come in and configure all these different options, including virtual machine infrastructure, SQL Server infrastructure, website infrastructure, so on and so forth. So if we see, here we go. You basically have a lot of different areas you can go into. I'll click around real quick and show you. So we have websites, we have SQL servers, we have, there's some MySQL. We also have the automation component, and we'll get into this, I think really in depth in next session.
Next session,
yeah. But just as a quick sneak peek, this is where we can go and really set up some really cool automation. But from the admin side, we also want to make sure that we can set up those plans. So we have this, administrator and tenant scenario, and we want to be able to offer our tenants specific plans. So here we see a plan for SQL databases, and if I go into this, we can see what the plan details. We can go in and see subscription settings, general settings overall. So there's not a whole lot here, but if we look at the advertise, actually that is, let me see, maybe dashboard. So yeah, we get the basics there. And if we come back out, we can also see the user accounts. So this is kind of the back-end administration, as I mentioned. The tenant side, and we'll go over here. We can see what we've offered out to our tenant in this case is to give them the capability to come in and we can see some SQL Server database options as well as some account options. So if I were to come in, I can see who I am, what my plan is. I can delete my account, change my passwords, do all that normal tenant stuff that you would expect to see. I can also come up into SQL, and we see I've got the option for add a new database, or in the bottom left, I've got this nice big button for new. If I click that, that opens our drawer, and within the drawer itself, this gives me the same option as up top here. So really easy to use, very simple. I can come in and say, my awesome database is the one I would like to create. We see the addition. We'll go ahead and keep it at default, and we'll give it an admin name. Oh. Let's hope those match. They do. And I went ahead and created that database. So we see some real-time updates actually popping up. We see that it created the database, successfully deleted one from earlier. And we'll go ahead and clear out some of these messages, and great. So MyAwesomeDB has been created, and now at this point, we can see how that actually interacts with our specific environment. Let me just minimize this briefly. And there's my mouse. Here we go. Oh, yeah. There we go. So if I come in and let's refresh this. In here, I should see, oh look, my awesome database has been created, and very easy for any tenant to come in and really work within the system, as Travis said, and create things on the fly and get that instant gratification, if you will, of being able to consume services on demand.
Right. Okay, so that's just kind of a quick overview of Windows Azure Pack, a very simple scenario. It can obviously get a lot more advanced than that when you start to expose plans to the tenants for virtual machines and websites and other applications like WordPress and things like that that can be deployed on this infrastructure as well. So kind of coming back to Microsoft's Cloud OS vision, underlying this vision, there's really kind of these 5 key things that need to happen. We need to create a consistent development platform. So we've got this consistent infrastructure platform, but it also enables a consistent development platform, because what's happening is all of these Azure platform as a service services like the service bus and multi-factor authentication and media services and all these things are all being delivered to run at a service provider or on premise, so that an application developer can create an application that will run and consume those application services, whether it's running in their own data center at a service provider or in Windows Azure. And this is great for developers because they can learn one skill set and one set of technologies and be able to build applications that live in an Azure type data center or at a service provider or on premise. So it creates a really valuable set of knowledge for a developer to have, so that they are very flexible in the types of applications they can build using the same tools and knowledge. And it also enables them to take their application and deploy it on premise and later decide to move all or portions of that application to a cloud-based service. Next, it's important to have consistency in management. So with System Center, you can manage your applications and infrastructure regardless of where that infrastructure is located. So with System Center, you can manage your virtual machine hosts with Virtual Machine Manager. You can do your backups of your services like Exchange or SQL. You can do file backups. It doesn't really matter where these resources are running. You can still back it up. You can still monitor things with Operations Manager regardless of where they're running. So you get one consistent user experience for your management across all of these different locations. Next is data. So with data, we want to make it easy to move data from one location to another. So since it's just SQL Server running in Azure, at a service provider, or on-premise, it's easy to move the databases around from one location to another. Next is identity. So with Windows Azure Active Directory, we have a cloud-based directory that's based on the same technology as our on-premise Active Directory, and so we have a consistent identity strategy across all these locations. And we have the same virtualization stack. So we have Hyper-V, Windows Server 2012 R2 Hyper-V, running as our hypervisor, whether it's on-premise at a service provider or in Windows Azure. It's the same exact technology stack. So when we look at building applications for the Cloud OS, it's just SQL Server. If you want to, you can run your database server inside of a VM for portability. So you can take that virtual machine that contains your SQL Server with the database in it, and you can move that machine up to the cloud. Or you can back up the database, move the database back up to the cloud, and restore it there, or vice versa, bring it from the cloud back to on-premise. And so the idea is that your data is portable because it's the same technology platform. So as you grow the database or the service over time, it might make more sense to put it in the cloud. If there are concerns with running it in the cloud from a security perspective, you're worried about the NSA Nazgul, you can take your data back out of the cloud and bring it on-premise easily. With websites, it's just IIS. Whether you're running in Windows Azure or on-premise or at a service provider, it's just IIS. So you create your database app pack once, and you can deploy that app pack into Windows Azure or on-premise. It doesn't matter. And lastly is the various Azure PaaS services, such as the service bus. The services are the same, whether it's running in Azure or the service provider or on-premise. So if you consume a service like the service bus, it doesn't really matter where it's located. You just change the configuration of your application to point to the location of that service, regardless of where it's actually running. And then when we look at managing the Cloud OS, identity is the same across all of these things because we have Active Directory. Provisioning is the same. We have App Controller to manage virtual machine provisioning across enterprise service provider and on-premise. And we have Orchestrator that can talk to all of these different services to automate provisioning of things, regardless of where they're running. And monitoring is also the same, regardless of where things are running. So managing the Cloud OS is all the same as well. Okay, now let's go back and let's review our concerns that we had with adopting cloud computing. We had the government requirements, right? We have to be able to keep our data in a data center that's in our own country. We have to be able to make sure that our data is secure. Well, if those are your requirements, you now have options. Maybe Windows Azure won't work for you because there's no Azure data center in your country. But now with Windows Azure Pack, a service provider that is in your country could be running the same technology that Windows Azure provides, but they're actually running it in a data center that's within your own country. Or you can take that same technology stack and run it in your own data center. So you still get all the benefits of Windows Azure without having to use Windows Azure data centers themselves. So those requirements or those challenges are minimized. With connectivity, you now have options as well. So if Windows Azure data center is far away from you and you have a slow connection to it, that's okay. You don't have to use Windows Azure data centers. You can use a service provider data center that's down the street from your office. And if that's not going to work for you, you can always run the Windows Azure technology within your own data center and have good connectivity to it. So that's also a concern that's minimized. And then when it comes to loss of control, you now have the option of running this cloud computing infrastructure in your own data center. You get all the benefits of it, but you have full control over it. And so this concern is also minimized. So it provides an opportunity for us to take advantage of this great new cloud computing platform that Microsoft is building for Windows Azure, but have more flexibility in the way that we're consuming it, because we can get it from a service provider or run it in our own data center. So if we look at the roadmap that Microsoft has going forward, it helps to look at the roadmap backwards first. So we can look at System Center 2012 was released in August of 2012. Sorry, Windows Server 2012 was released in August 2012. And then System Center 2012 SP1 was released in January, just 4 months after that. So that's when System Center 2012 SP1, that's when it first supported Windows Server 2012. And then they entered into, they actually merged the teams at Microsoft. Windows Server and System Center are now one engineering team. And they go through the entire software development lifecycle together, from planning all the way through release. And we saw the first release that they did together come out, well, in October. So that was the Windows Server 2012 R2, System Center 2012 R2 release. And that happened just 9 months after the System Center 2012 SP1 release happened. And so we can see that Microsoft is accelerating the pace at which they are releasing software. And we can expect to see that going forward. We won't see these long 3-year development cycles anymore. We'll see faster iterations coming from Microsoft, and they'll be released together. Windows Server and System Center and Windows Azure Pack will continue to be released together going forward. So what will Microsoft focus on going forward? They will be, as I mentioned earlier, designing software for the cloud. They'll be designing it to be highly scalable, operable, performant, multi-tenant, RESTful APIs, all these things that are important to be able to operate in a cloud computing model. They'll be focused on doing that. They'll drive consistency of Azure between Azure and running Azure services on-premise through the Windows Azure Pack. So we saw that there is a large number of services available in Azure and a subset of those available on-premise today. Over time, all of those services that are in Windows Azure will eventually be able to run on-premise as well. And they'll focus on delivering value-added services from the cloud. So some great examples of this are things like like the Hyper-V Recovery Manager, the backup to Windows Azure, and I'm drawing a blank on the what's the one that sits on top of Ops Manager? Oh, Advisor, System Center Advisor. So these are all services that are delivered from the cloud, and they attach to on-premise System Center management. Another great example is Global Service Monitor, which attaches to Operations Manager, where you monitor applications from points of presence all over the world, and then it hooks into Operations Manager so you can see your application performance and availability from that service. And then Microsoft will continue, of course, to improve what they already have. So we can expect to see them add additional capability to the existing components of the System Center suite. And so in summary, we can realize the benefits of cloud computing. We can reduce our costs. We can have access from anywhere. We can have faster time to deployment. We can have flexible, scalable, and dynamic infrastructure. And we can have reduced complexity. All these promises of the cloud, we can actually realize those much easier now because of Microsoft's Windows Azure Pack strategy, because you can now get that cloud platform running in your own data center or at a service provider, and it makes it just so much easier to actually move to the cloud. So with that, we're done with the keynote presentation. Are there any questions that people have about Microsoft's Cloud OS strategy that we could try to answer? Yeah.
When will desktop and service be?
That's a great question.
That is a great question.
Especially since Amazon just announced that, what was that, maybe a month ago, right? So that's a great question. I will not answer that question, even though I know the answer, because I'm not a Microsoft employee anymore. So you'd have to ask a Microsoft employee that question. So, okay. Any other questions? How many people would use a desktop as a service solution? One? Just one? That's it?
Two.
Okay. Two?
Yeah.
All right, 2 takers. All right, good.
Sold.
Sold, we'll build it. All right, awesome. Okay, any other questions? Okay, very good. So we'll be available up here for questions as well. And I believe at this point we're going to split into 2 tracks, right? And the business track stays here?
No, we're over at the lunch.
Oh, we're over in the lunch area, is the business decision maker type track. And then this is the technical track here.
About
DPM here. Okay, so DPM here, over in the cafeteria area, we'll be talking about automation. So kind of making a business case for investing in automation, and we'll be demonstrating the integration of Service Manager and the new service management automation platform. So please come join us for that if you're interested in that. Otherwise, the DPM session will be in here. And how long is the break? Like 10 minutes?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay, 10-minute break. So thank you.
Thank you.